Now, having done my sort of due diligence in talking about the limitations of our sources of what we know about pre-Russian Denina social organization, I now like to actually talk about what we do know, or at least what we think we know. And so to return to this idea of nested relationships. So every society, as I said earlier last week, every society has to come up with an answer to who's related to who. And particularly in many societies that matters critically, because those, as it did in Denina society, as it does in Denina society, because it regulates traditionally who works with who is in charge, where you might live, options you have for where you might live, things like that. So every society has to have a kinship system. And then also every society has to have a political system, and sometimes those are the same thing and sometimes they aren't. Generally speaking, in the US, more generally, we don't have political and kinship system aren't the same thing, although one could certainly wonder if they're the same thing when you sometimes have sort of political dynasties like the Kennedy family, like the Bush family, like the Clinton family, or perhaps someday like the Trump family. So one might wonder if perhaps our kinship and political systems are at least a little bit intertwined. But generally speaking, in many indigenous societies, those systems are much, much more intertwined. But every society then has a kinship system. Every society also has to have a political system. By that, I mean a way of figuring out power, a way of figuring out rules, a way of figuring out social order. Social order, to be blunt, can be good or bad, depending on what your perspective is, right? You could have a social order that's oppressive to people. So by social order, we don't necessarily mean orderly or good. We simply mean a state of affairs, a status quo, a stable arrangement, at least for the time of a society. And any society is going to have a social order, going to have an understanding of how things should be done and how things get decided in our society and how people ought to behave. And any society is going to have sort of social control mechanisms, as we sometimes say. That makes it sound rather dark and diabolical, right? Social control mechanisms. It sounds almost Foucauldian, right? This idea that we're being controlled by our society. But indeed we are. To some degree. And indeed, that's not always a bad thing. And it doesn't always have to be a really oppressive or controlling thing, right? We're all grateful for the social order that says you stop at a stop sign. And we're grateful for the many social control mechanisms we have, not just formal ones like a police officer, because most of the time the police officer isn't there to pull you over for running a stop sign. But instead, we have a lot of other social control mechanisms that are a lot less forceful. For example, a feeling of guilt and shame when you run a stop sign, which you should feel. It's not safe. Or the fact that somebody might honk their horn at you to remind you, hey, don't be a jerk. Now, honking your horn doesn't actually do anything to that person, but it's a reminder. And for a species that's so tightly keyed into how we're being socially thought of or approved of, that has an effect on us, an almost visceral effect. Nobody likes getting honked at. At least most of us don't like getting honked at. So social control mechanisms don't have to be coercive. And indeed, that is one of the points I want to talk about today, because it can be easy in our modern society to be so enmeshed in our world that we think that for there to be control or order in a society, for rules to be followed, there has to be some kind of formal legal network and presumably some agents to enforce that, such as judges or lawyers or police. And indeed, that's oftentimes how we think of social issues in our society. If a situation gets too bad, we turn to legal recourse, a lawsuit, a judge, perhaps police, depending on the situation and depending on how comfortable we are with that. But for most of human history, or for a lot of human history in a lot of parts of the world, there was no such thing as a written legal code framework. There certainly wasn't such a thing as a government that could throw people in prison, or that there may or may not have been such a thing as a political leader that could command things like an execution. Some societies had that, a lot of societies didn't. There are a lot of societies where there was no prison. There was no government in the sense that we think of government, some huge bureaucracy with the ability to impose taxes or throw you in prison, right? There was no police force in the sense that we think of that term. So then the question is, was it just chaos and anarchy? Was it sort of The Purge, right? Those movies, I've never seen those movies. They look terrible. Anyways, was it something like that, something chaotic in societies like that? And the answer is definitely not in most cases. In many, many cases, I don't want to over idealize, but in many cases, societies were able to get their people to follow the rules at least enough of the time to be pretty stable without having to have a sprawling bureaucracy or police force. So what did that look like? What did social order look like? How is it that you got people to be kind to each other and to get along all right with each other? When we think of that in the Denina case, we have to think again about these two types of relationships. So I've got here in blue, geographic relationships or residency relationships, and in red, kinship relationships. And I want you to think about relationships as sort of ties that bind people together, as well as obligations and expectations that create a structure within which people can have meaning and within which people have a sense of who they are and what they should do and shouldn't do, at least within reason. So let's talk first about the kinship system. It starts with regional bands, it moves down to villages or kaye, and then it moves down to homes or nichiri. So let's talk about each. Oh, and then it goes down to the individual, of course. And then from the individual, you can go back out to the immediate family or the multi-generational family, the clan, and then the moiety. So let's talk first about bands. Traditionally in Dena'ina society, there appear to have been, and I say appear to have been because sources like Osgood, as far as I know, don't actually mention these, but other sources bring it up. There appear to have been 15 to 20 so then the bands, there were these regional bands, and I'll show you a picture of one of these first. So this is from Jim Carey's Dena'ina Topical Dictionary, the revised edition. So thank you, Dr. Carey, for this. But basically what the Roman numeral numbers are is regional bands. These aren't the entire borders of the regional bands. It's instead kind of implying like this is sort of the general area, right, of Catalan, for example. These very often end with an NA, which indicates that it's sort of the group of. So for example, Katnutana, or the Dena'ina of Katnu River or of Kenai River. And so each of these bands is sort of a general geographic area in which there was Dena'ina people. You might ask what was above the level of a band, and the answer is nothing was above the level of a band. Or perhaps we might say kinship is, but there's no like grand council over all of these groups, but instead each regional band was a group of people who saw themselves as sort of related with or within the same territory. And actually, even within the band, what there actually were was potentially 1 to 3 or 4 villages that were sort of loosely affiliated with each other, each of which actually had their own leader. There wasn't necessarily somebody over the entire region. So a regional band then was sort of a grouping of villages which were close to each other, had very, very similar histories, had very, very similar language. As a result of that, they would be of part of the same dialects. And so each of them again would have 1, 2, 3, or 4 villages that were part of that village, or sorry, part of that regional band. Total, there appears to have been 15 to 20. Some of these identities, some of these labels that people had attached to different groups or to themselves, we no longer have people that remember that identity very well or that would identify as that. And indeed, in modern day language, people don't, although sometimes people will talk in terms of these regional bands, more often people will talk in terms of the specific village or the specific tribal entity that they're affiliated with. But prior to or early on in colonialism, regional bands were very significant as sort of a broader grouping. Within the bands, though, had a lot of interactions between each other. So for example, during the winter, when it was easier to go over like frozen lakes and ponds and things like that, people would very often travel between villages and even travel between entire bands, right? And they were also connected by kinship ties. So for example, in Peter Kalfornsky's book, he talks about the fact that, as with many, many young men in Dena'ina society traditionally, he went and spent a good chunk of time living with his maternal uncle, with his mom's brother. I think here or here, in one of the villages across the inlet. So he starts out here, but then is living over here. And I bring that up because people would move, right, different areas. Sometimes people would go to different areas just to share news, traveling extensive distances. There were trails crisscrossing between the different regional bands, crisscrossing what we now think of as the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, or going up this way, or presumably going this way. There were trails long before there was sort of national refuge trails or something like that. There were Dena'ina trails cross-cutting these different villages. And indeed, it was an important part of traditional Dena'ina society that when visitors came from another band or from another village, you warmly welcomed them, you brought them in, you were hospitable, you fed them a big meal. And very often this was a time of, at least in some parts of Cook Inlet, like excited news, like tell us stuff, like tell us what's going on in other places. And that's kind of how news would travel between different communities. And so the different villages and the different bands, generally speaking, and villages within that, right? There was interaction between the different bands. These weren't like hard and fast borders that you couldn't cross into another band's area. It was just sort of a general sense of what sort of type of Dena'ina people lived in this area, what type of Dena'ina people lived in this area. Now, you take the band, you go a little bit smaller, and you get the kaya, or the village. Villages were several households together, several nichil, several of these large multi-generation households put together in one village. And very often folks in a village were related to each other. That was not always the case. And again, you could move between villages. If you didn't like the leader, you could move to another village, or if you just felt like going to another village, you could go to another village. But you oftentimes had a lot of people that related to each other from a single clan, or you sometimes had, let's say, 3 or 4 different clans, but a bunch of people that were related through kinship sort of living in the same area. And this is a map of just some of the different villages in sort of the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s kind of time period. As you can see, there were a lot. And as you can see, some of these are still villages, or towns such as Nandalton or Lime Village or Kenai, and some of these no longer, right? Some of these, like Kijik, for example, are no longer, or Old Iliamna, no longer villages, or at least are not to the same degree anymore. And some of these are in areas that have since been supplanted by other cities, by settler cities, and therefore people were sort of moved from a traditional area maybe into another area. So a lot of people from Anchorage area that were Dena'ina eventually ended up settling, for example, in a Klutna area, a Klutna village. And so that's a little bit about that. Within the village, there was some sources, I think in large part because of how Osgood said it, a lot of sources will call this like different classes of people in the village. I don't love the class terminology. This may be my own sort of views of society bleeding over into my anthropology, and I hope that's not the case. But to me, I wonder sometimes if early anthropologists that were calling these classes, if they were maybe sort of projecting a little bit of their own social upbringing onto these societies. There were certainly different categories of people. Whether they're classes or not, maybe I'll leave that for you to decide, but certainly different categories, and I'll explain those briefly. So for one thing, there were Geshka. There's multiple different ways to spell it that you'll see. This is the way that I favor, Qeshqa, or Geshka. These were leaders of the villages, or in certain cases, again, like over more Iliamna area, you could have multiple Geshka in one village, or sometimes the term was sort of used collectively to refer to the heads of different clans within a village. So again, it could be 4 or 5 different people, all of whom are viewed as leaders and elders in a society. Well, a Geshka, gets translated a lot of different ways when it's not in Dena'ina. So people, reflecting a Russian influence, people will sometimes say Toyan. Rich man, wealthy man, respected leader is another way that people will sometimes translate this. Chief is another way people translate this. Geshka, to oversimplify, I'll only present it as like the villages that had one Geshka. It gets more complicated when it's multiple. But a Geshka was a lot of things. And I think the best way to explain it personally is to say that they were the father or mother of the entire village. So Geshka was typically the oldest person in the clan that was like the predominant clan in that area, in that village. They were also typically very wealthy. But we have to think about what wealthy means, and we have to disentangle ourselves from sort of Euro-American notions of wealth to understand that wealth operated very differently in many Alaska Native societies. So wealth in this context, a better way to think about it might be they were very successful as social relationships, because what you had was a relationship where you had the Geshka as kind of the head of a lineage, the head of a clan in a specific area, the eldest male of a specific family, or the eldest person of a specific family line in a specific area. And they had the Nikulka, or the clan helpers, other people that were in the clan but were not recognized as Geshka. And they would funnel resources towards the Geshka. They would share things from the fish, and then the Geshka would make sure that all the fish were stored for the winter in the catches, in the storage pits, okay? And then the Geshka during the winter would often be the one in charge of making sure that each family and each individual got some of the fish each day out of the storage pit that they'd been storing for the winter. Basically, everybody pulls it together. Geshka takes care of it. Literally, sometimes they were called the keeper of the cache, is I think how Billy Pete refers to them, and then distributes out the fish during the winter to make sure that everybody's got some and that nobody's overusing. They had a lot of other roles as well, though, but let's go back to the wealth idea. Wealth in this context, usually Geshka had dentalium shells, these shells that were used as currency. And so, for example, like 5 shells would equal a seal skin, for example, or 5 shells would equal a caribou skin. So in theory, it was a way of trading, or representing wealth that the Geshka had. But in reality, the Geshka kind of had wealth that the entire village and all these relatives were sort of pooling together. And so it wasn't just sort of the Geshka's wealth to just sort of be rich and lord it over people, but instead it was sort of a sign of a lot of people that have worked together and pooled wealth together. And so the Geshka's prosperity is in a sense a reflection of the village's prosperity. But the Geshka is kind of the one organizing it all. The Geshka then, when we say wealthy man, we should understand that it wasn't so much that the wealthy had an oppressive power over the commoners, as they're sometimes called. I prefer to think of it as a kinship relationship, where you had a head of a clan in an area that was drawing on clan relationships, people that were obligated through clan relationships, and therefore able to organize labor and organize resources, which is indeed a kind of political power, but not one nearly so hierarchical as the ones that we often experience. Geshka played a lot of really critical roles in the village too. One of which is they were often recognized as Geshka, recognized as wealthy, recognized as good organizers of people, partly through the fact that they would often throw potlatches. And so potlatches serve many, many different roles in societies that practice them across the Pacific coast, including Dena'ina society. In Dena'ina society, traditionally you had what was called the big potlatch, which was basically a potlatch that was done when somebody died by a close relative or just a close friend of the deceased, who would then throw a large potlatch, invite people from the other moiety, invite out, so to speak, outsiders called friends of the deceased, and there would be a large multi-day remembering of the deceased. The Geshka would usually give a very long speech about the deceased. They would sing songs, sometimes about the deceased, and they would participate in games and different things in kind of this multi-day celebration / commemoration, serious commemoration to recognize the life of the deceased. Somebody that gave a lot of potlatches for deceased members of their village could over time sort of gain prominence and prestige as a leader-like person and eventually move into being a Geshka type person. Now Geshka, you get some conflicting information from different historians and anthropologists. Some say that it would, but most people seem to agree that it was hereditary sometimes, and this makes sense, the Geshka would pass it along to one of his children or her children. But very often, you could also become a Geshka sort of just by becoming respected over time in a community, accumulating resources, throwing potlatches, over time gaining this position of prominence. Generally speaking, a Geshka had to be agreed upon by everybody, or else they didn't count as a Geshka. And if you didn't like one, you could also just leave. So that's a very different relationship than the one we sometimes have in our own society, with, for example, the federal government. It's not very easy to just leave your country, but it was relatively straightforward to leave your village. It wasn't convenient, obviously, but it was relatively straightforward. You didn't have to sort of get a visa or something. So Geshkas then, sort of by necessity of that arrangement, had to be people that people liked, right? That people had confidence in. They were elite. When we talk about sort of, the whole John Locke idea of sort of the consent of the governed and people, sort of a social contract, Geshka among Dena'ina people is very much a kind of classic real world example of that, of the idea of people deciding this person's our leader, right? He'll make a lot of decisions and we're okay with that and we'll support them so long as they're worth supporting. Now, I want to note, by the way, you'll have noticed that I used mostly male pronouns in talking about the Geshka. In theory, they could, at least according to early sources, they could be male or female. So that's very important to remember. Similarly, religious roles, most of the religious roles could in theory be male or female, or others. In practice, Geshka were very often male. I've yet to find a historical record specifically of a female Geshka, although they may very well be out there, and if somebody wants to send me one, please do. But any of the chiefs, at least during the Russian period and American period that I've heard of, have always been male. One could argue that that's a reflection of sort of the fact that Russian traders wanted to trade with men as the leaders of the village, reflecting sort of patriarchal notions in their society. Nonetheless, we don't have a lot of indication from other sources either that the female Geshka were very common, but it was at least in theory possible, which is notable and very different from some societies. Now, the Geshka, I was saying a second ago, fulfilled a lot of really critical roles. I'd like to talk about a few. One of them was that when, as a very elderly man and a well-respected man, part of what the Geshka did is that when certain men in the village were off hunting, Geshka would make sure that the families of the hunters were well taken care of. They would call on people that maybe hadn't gone on the hunting party, other men that were just kind of hanging around the village or whatever, and be like, hey, go fetch these people some firewood. Because that was traditionally like something for like older boys to do, was to get firewood for people. So it's like, hey, go get firewood, go set fires for, go do campfires for these people so they can cook up their food. They'd make sure those families had food. They'd also taken orphans. So traditionally the practice was that if somebody had, their parents had died or something else had happened, that they would go with a close relative. But in cases where they didn't have a close relative, the Geshka became sort of the default caretaker of orphans. And he or she would adopt them as their own and then they would sort of become part of their family unit. By the way, like I was saying, Geshka were typically male. Their wives, I think the right term was Qisqu, but they were also recognized as sort of a prominent woman in the community, and the children were also recognized as prominent. A term, I think GGIGA, but I could be wrong, but it essentially means the English-speaking Dena'ina would sometimes translate it as like prince or princess, but basically like a prominent child. The children were kind of prominent as well. And oftentimes, though, the mother of, or sorry, the wife of the Geshka, the mother in that lineage, she was in charge of lineage matter, or she was in charge of marriage matters for her daughters. And so she sort of determined who would be marrying into this powerful Geshka family. So I think that's a significant portion of power, obviously. And indeed, there are certain ways people would talk about the Geshka, about even like their house. They would refer to it as the Geshka's wife's house. So it was very obvious, and like sometimes refer to the potlatches that the Geshka was throwing as like the wife actually throwing the potlatch. So the idea there was that even though the Geshka was organizing it, it sort of reflected positively on the clan and lineage of his wife. So that's worth noting as well. So they would take care of orphans. They would take care of families of people that were traveling or maybe off in war. They would teach young people about the values of Dena'ina society, how to be good people. They would organize labor. They would, again, keep track of resources, fish that had been accumulated, skins that had been accumulated. Later, during the Russian trading period, the Geshka would be the ones that would be the intermediaries between the Russian traders and the Dena'ina village, taking furs that had been accumulated by the workers in the village and then trading them with Russian traders for things like steel pots, steel weapons, and bringing that back to the village and distributing it. Geshkas were also, and here's where we get into social control, Geshka were also mediators. This wasn't something that apparently needed to happen too terribly often, but when a situation would get bad enough that it couldn't be solved between the two people or between maybe some extended family, the Geshka could step in and kind of say, well, I think you're right and you're wrong. And generally by virtue of the fact of being a highly respected person, people would listen to the Geshka on these matters. There was also a hunting chief as well. I'm trying to remember, I think I have it in my notes here. Hold on, if I can find it. Can't find it right now. Oh, here we go. Ilka, Peshka. Not finding it. I'll find it at some point and then be sad that I couldn't find it during the lecture. But in any case, there was a hunting chief. These were usually a younger man than the Geshka and somebody that was in charge basically of where and when to hunt among the clan and in the village. And they also held a prominent role and kind of when the Russians came and the early Americans and kind of saw these people the way they saw it, kind of through their own lens of the way their societies worked. They kind of saw this almost like a vice chief, kind of like a second in command kind of situation. Sometimes they would be the son-in-law of the Geshka. That was not uncommon, which makes sense with what I was saying about sort of the mother of the home would sort of bring in hand-picked people that they thought would be good husbands for their daughters into this powerful Geshka family. So that's the village. Like I said, you have the Nakulka, the clan helpers that are sometimes referred to as the commoners, but I think that kind of gives it the wrong idea since the wealth was sort of held by the Geshka, but sort of functioning as a redistributive system, right? A system where sort of the Geshka makes sure everybody's provided for. You'll see some sources mention slaves. That's very unclear. Even Osgood, who's kind of the first one to bring that up, or one of the people to bring that up, he kind of brings it up just so long as to say, like, I don't think this was ever practiced very much. I don't think it was practiced necessarily at all. Others have suggested it was, but that slaves is probably really the wrong term for it. Instead, sometimes during war, you would have somebody that would be taken captive and they would be, as one source says, they would be taken captive for like a year and treated well, fed, they're not like imprisoned or something, but they're like kept in the village. And then, so they are captive. But after a year, they're allowed to leave if they want to. And sometimes people did and sometimes people didn't. So it's a bit about that. We'll talk about warfare in a second if you were interested about that. So then there was partnerships between and within Kaye. So in addition to kind of the relationship between the Geshka and the clan helpers, there was also this relationship called Selden within the village. Illet on, I think might also be a Denino way of saying that from the Jim Carrey's topical dictionary, but it's basically like a best friendship between two people that, although maybe that's the wrong word too, basically two people that were allies in a village and they would go hunting together. And if one of them was murdered, it would be understood that the other member of that Selden would potentially avenge them. And they would potentially, they might be the person throwing the potlatch if they passed and things like that. There's also Slosin. So Slosin is a fascinating relationship. Slosin is basically at the village level. So each village is essentially autonomous unto itself. Again, they might be part of a bigger band of sort of related or geographically close villages, but generally speaking, each village is its own thing and the Geshka is the leader. But between the different Kaye, between the different villages, one Geshka and another Geshka would typically, you'd have partnerships between them, between the Geshkaina, if you want to say it that way. And thus there was a partnership between the communities. And this partnership was, among other things, a trading relationship. They would trade sometimes. They would sometimes throw a potlatch. They would sometimes throw celebrations together. Probably one of the biggest things, though, one of the most important things about this relationship is that if one person's for some reason, if one village had an extreme calamity, an extremely bad situation, for example, their fish cache for the winter somehow got infected or somehow got too warm or something and therefore got messed up and you couldn't eat it, you don't want to starve during the winter, obviously, so the other village would provide partially for you, and vice versa. If the other village had a hard time the next winter, you would provide for them. So it was mutual aid. Usually, by the way, these were opposite moiety, so it was sort of this geographic relationship that was beyond sort of the kinship relationship, and sort of to some degree even violated rules of the kinship relationship. So very interesting type of cooperation. Okay, well, that's about that. Let's talk a little bit now about, okay, actually let's pause there.